exponential growth in the market for whatever. And all they mean is it's going up. It's going up maybe steeply. This is actually exponential growth. This, like, I mean, pretty much every year it's doubling. So I am really excited to, you know, see what we have in 2018, 2019. I think we are going to learn a lot more. Okay, right now we know a little bit, and this is kind of an overview of the space I'm going to be sampling from. There are regional differences in the brain. There are differences in networks. Those of you, I know this is a very diverse audience, so, you know, the imaging nerds who are all about, you know, network analyses, whatever, yes, there are interesting network findings. The rest of you, don't worry about it. The point is there are differences found in brain structure, in brain function, on cognitive functions, on emotional functions, early in life and later in life. Okay, so let's meander through that rather large space of research and talk about the policy relevance of these things as we visit each one. Why did I just turn those letters blue? I'll tell you why. This slide is going to come up a total of 3 times. And just so you don't kind of keep thinking, oh my God, there's just like all these slides with a lot of words on them. Give me a break. This, you know, the ones that are blue, you've seen this before. It's just a statement of the overall space that we're exploring. Okay. So what is neuroscience? No, darn. I don't know why it does that. Okay. It did it before and then it stopped doing it. But anyway, you don't have to worry. There wasn't anything important in that first slide. So this is a paper published a few years ago now by Kim Noble, former graduate student, analyzing over 1,000 structural MRI scans of the brain of 1,000 normal, healthy kids as a function of their socioeconomic status. So she was able to just ask a very simple question: how does brain structure depend on SES? And a few nice features of this study are that she covaried a lot of things that you would want to see covaried, including genetic ancestry, as well as sex and age, and even niceties like looking at income covarying education, looking at education covarying income. They do make independent contributions. And here's in a nutshell what she found. This is a map of the regions of the cortical surface that remain significant. You can see 10 to the negative 5 power. So these are very conservative analysis showing a bunch of regions, in particular, you know, medial frontal, inferior temporal, insula, other areas, superior frontal, that differ among normal healthy kids as a function of their income. Okay, why does this brain look funny for those of you who aren't imaging nerds? It's a way of representing the surface of the brain that opens up the sulci. You know, the brain has creases in it. Those are called sulci. And if you're interested in seeing how structure varies even down in the sulci as well as up on top of the ridges, the gyri, you sort of you represent it in this way. So this was a very interesting analysis, which she then went further in examining by saying, let's look at this relationship between family income and surface area over different levels of income. Let's not just assume, oh, you know, regression, linear regression, we're going to assume it's a linear relationship. Let's actually look at the shape of this relationship. And although for sure there is a lot of spread at a given level of income, okay, I should just, what am I? Yeah, is this? There we go, yeah. Okay, so yes, there's a lot of spread here. This is why we call them scatter plots. But the relationship is flatter here than it is here. You can see at the very lowest level of income, the effect of changing income by a small amount has a bigger effect. Now you might say, oh, I mean, that's such a tiny effect compared to this variance. Well, it is tiny, but what your eyeballs don't tell you, looking at this, that the statistical analyses do tell you, is that this is significantly steeper than this. Okay, why should we care? Well, one thing it tells us is that at least through the window of brain structure, changes in income at the low level are much more impactful than changes in income at a higher level. From a policy point of view, that could be interesting. So, you know, in policy, we want the biggest bang for our buck because there are limited amounts of money to help children. And, you know, you might expect that, oh, there's a kind of floor below which nothing helps, right? If you're really, really poor, it's hopeless. You're not, you know, anything we give you is not going to help you. And you might expect what is sometimes called a Matthew effect, which is the kids who already have kind of something going for them are more able to benefit from interventions, supplementation, and so forth. But what this shows us is no, at least from the point of view of brain structure, this is where the best action can be had. Okay. So that's a sample of what we know. Oh, let me tell you one other thing about this. So this is just brain structure. Who cares about brain structure, right? I mean, what we care about is kids and their ability to think and learn and that sort of a thing. Well, they did a very interesting analysis that showed us that, in fact, these structural differences do impact ability to think and learn, et cetera. They did what statisticians call a mediation analysis, and I know there are a few people in this room who will be thinking, not mediation again, because earlier we had a long conversation about that. They did a mediation analysis using the brain data to try to account for differences between higher and lower income kids on cognitive testing. And what they found was not all cognitive tests, but some cognitive tests, and in particular tests of executive function, were in the SES effect on executive function was in part explained by the SES effect on brain structure. Okay, so that's our first sample, looking at structure and cognition. Here's another example, and again, this is, you've seen this before. That's what I'm aiming to remind you of by putting it in blue. What does neuroscience know about functional brain function as illuminated by functional imaging and emotional functions? Well, here is a very cool study, I think it's cool, done by Pil-Young Kim at the University of Denver. She studies mother-child relationships and in particular, first-time new mothers and their relations with their infants. What she found is a special case of a general trend, very sad general trend, which is as follows. The lower your SES, the more reactive your brain is to negative, depressing, or threatening stimuli. And the less reactive your brain is to happy, cheerful, uplifting stimuli. And if we go back and think about that depression gradient we saw a few slides back, I mean, that would certainly set you up to be more likely to be depressed. Well, what Pil-Young did with these first-time moms, the moms spanned a range of socioeconomic status, and she showed them not just generic happy pictures and upsetting pictures like the previous studies. She showed them pictures of happy babies or pictures of crying, fussy babies. And she found the same thing, namely, if you look at amygdala activity here as a function of income to needs ratio, where 1 is the federal poverty line, and 6 you're definitely well into middle class. She found that the higher your SES measured by income, the less reactive your right amygdala was to pictures of baby faces looking unhappy, crying, fussy. And then she also showed happy babies and looked at left amygdala activation to them. And what she found is the higher your SES, the more you respond to happy pictures of happy babies. Now, just like Kim Noble found that her structural differences actually helped account for the kids' capabilities on cognitive tests, Pil-Young found that when she videotaped the moms and the babies interacting in a sort of, semi-natural situation, they're in a playroom of some research suite, but the mom and the baby are interacting, they videotape the interaction, they have raters who know how to, dissect mother-infant mutual responses and who are blind to the SES of this mother-infant pair. They found that the low SES moms were less patient and less warm and more intrusive with the baby. And we're talking a normal range of behavior, right? These are not moms who are abusive or, you'd see them on the street and go, oh my God, rescue that child. No, this is just, normal variation. But as the SES of the moms went up, so did the warmth and supportiveness and, inclination to let the kid be a little bit free. The question, do these differences in amygdala activity mediate those observed differences in maternal behavior towards the babies? The answer, yes, in part. These are partial mediations. It doesn't account for every last drop of the variance in maternal behavior, but it statistically significantly accounts for some of that relationship. We can say, again, this is somewhat relevant to policy in the sense that who here has heard of the 30 million word gap? Yeah, a fair number of people. And programs like, Sharon, you didn't raise your hand and you probably consulted to, oh, did you? Okay. Providence talks and various other programs that are interventions for low SES families to try to improve child outcomes through coaching and encouraging and training moms to interact verbally with their kids in certain ways. And my understanding is the programs maybe they just need a little more fine-tuning, back to the drawing board, but they have not been as successful as was hoped. Well, you know, a project like this makes you wonder, maybe we should be paying more attention to the emotional state of the moms, especially moms of small babies, and, you know, maybe just making them a little less, you know, apt to notice negative emotional stimuli, more apt to notice positive things in general, might improve maternal-infant relations. Let me say that, again, this is a maybe. This is very early days. I think in 10 years, there are going to be some proven policy implications from this work. Right now, this is just, okay, here are some examples of how you might see this figuring in a policy discussion. Okay, one more. What do we know? Okay, I talked about these different approaches with different kinds of imaging. I talked about cognitive and emotional. Let's just talk a little bit about when these effects emerge. You know, how early do you have to get in there to impact and to get people on a happier, healthier trajectory? Well, this is a question that I undertook with my colleagues at Penn, Laura Betancourt, et cetera, Hallam Hurt. Hallam, who is a neonatologist, recruited 1-month-old babies, healthy 1-month-old babies, unsedated, put them in a scanner to measure their brain volume. And the subjects spanned a range of socioeconomic status. And what she found, this is a gratuitous slide. I just find it so cute. I love the shape of baby heads when seen on MRI. Anyway, but here's what we found. Another very scattered scatter plot, which nevertheless shows a statistically reliable trend here. The higher your SES, the larger your cortical gray matter. Okay, the more cortex you have in terms of volume. That's kind of alarming, I find. That's starting very early. On the other hand, you know, we were somewhat surprised by this finding. And then, once we got it, we kind of thought, duh, prenatal life. Prenatal life is when the brain is constructed. And the conditions of prenatal life, we know, affect all kinds of physical development, fetally and postnatally. And in fact, there's very interesting results now coming out showing that things like maternal stress, as well as exposure to environmental toxins and so forth, in utero predict later behavioral development. So what I would say about this in terms of potentially someday applying this kind of work to policy is, okay, prenatal may be even more important than we realized. We can't sort of wait around until kids are 3 years old, 4 years old, and say, oh, well, we have a good preschool to send them to. We really need to get in there early. And the good news is, to the extent that the prenatal period is a strongly determinative or a highly influential period for brain development, it's a fairly contained short period. Of course, we want to make sure that everybody at all stages of life have proper nutrition, are protected from environmental toxins, are not suffering undue stress, and so forth. But that has proven hard to do. We have not yet done it in our society. But maybe if we know, okay, before birth, maybe there's 9 months, maybe it turns out there's a certain trimester that's critical, and then we could focus it in 3 months. I'm not saying give up on the rest of the lifespan, but that does make our job seem more feasible, potentially. Anyway, okay. So having sampled a few examples of this rapidly growing, this exponentially, and I'm literally exponentially growing literature, and talked a little bit about how it might eventually kind of ramify on policy. Let me ask the next question, which is, how and why is SES related to brain structure and function? And first of all, I want to say neuroscience is really good at mechanism. We can inherit understanding about human development by studying what we've learned with animals, by applying what we've learned with animals. We can make direct measurements relevant to mechanism, and so forth, inspired by neuroscience. So in this case, the greatest potential to inform policy lies in the understanding of mechanism, how and why low SES is associated with bad outcomes. What are the candidate mechanisms? Well, based on social science research and based on primarily experimental animal research, where you can actually expose animals to toxins on an experimental basis and so forth, or stress them intentionally, it looks like there are both physical mechanisms that could explain these differences. Toxin exposure, nutrition. There may be genetic causes. Much is unknown. There could be psychological causes, including stress. And if you are wondering, well, does stress really vary between low and high SES? Oh, yes, it does. The idea that people with demanding professions, like the people in this room, we're the ones that are really stressed. No. What's really stressful is to wonder if you can, afford the car fare to go to a job interview to start earning money because you were laid off from your last job because you had to stay home and take care of your sick kid, and your job has no benefits, and you have to decide between paying for the heat or paying the rent, and you've already moved from one place to another, and et cetera, and your brother-in-law is addicted to drugs and he's stealing everything he can find in the house, and I mean, it's quite extraordinary. The part of what got me interested in this field was getting to know some poor people. And every time I thought I couldn't hear anything stranger and more horrifying, I heard something even stranger and more horrifying. And in addition, nice systematic sociological research confirms that, if you take a list of events that anybody would count as highly stressful, and you count how many of these events are experienced as a function of SES, it goes up quite steadily. So stress is potentially a huge and powerful cause of these differences. And thanks to excellent animal research, the way in which stress impacts the brain has been pretty well sorted out. There's a lot known about stress physiology and the brain and the effects of stressful environments on those brain systems. In addition, cognitive and linguistic stimulation, going back to the 30 million word gap, which I guess not everybody raised their hand, so I should tell the people who didn't what that refers to. It refers to the difference in the number of words that a kindergartner from a very poor home and a well-to-do home has heard in their life before entering kindergarten. So there's just a lot less exposure to learning opportunities, a lot less cognitive and linguistic engagement. Okay, so how do we figure out which of these things might be going on? Well, when you're dealing with observational data, just correlating this and this, you never really know what's cause, what's effect. What is really helpful is an intervention. And interventions are obviously socially good, but they're also scientifically good. They are essentially like experiments. So some children receive the intervention. Some children are in the control group. They don't receive the intervention. And in a really good study, like the one I'm going to tell you about in a couple of minutes, assignment to those two groups is random. So there's no difference, out of the gate in the kinds of kids that you're studying in the intervention and in the control. You've randomized them just like in a medical study with randomized placebo-controlled study. Okay, so in that way, an intervention can be really informative scientifically. If the intervention helps, then the effects can't be totally genetic. Now, does this seem like a straw man? Would anybody think the effects are totally genetic? I'm sorry to say that some people do, and I refer you to the bell curve by Murray and Bernstein. But clearly, if you can get these effects in an environmental intervention, then that's not the case. And the types of the intervention tell us about the types of causes. So if you have a nutritional intervention, and you've got low-income kids, and they differ by whether or not they got, some nutritional supplement, that tells you that part of the disparity, part of the SES disparity, is due to nutrition. Same for cognitive stimulation and so forth. And this tells us what would be useful as a policy matter to actually try to prevent or remediate the kinds of disadvantages that go on here. I'm looking for Michael. How much longer should I speak?
Another 10 minutes or so.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Okay, so what intervention project am I going to tell you about? Probably a lot of people here have already figured out. The Abecedarian project. Okay, this is a project that started in the 1970s in North Carolina. It was started by Sharon and Craig Ramey, who are sitting here up front. Yay! And it was not a hit and run intervention. They took kids early in infancy, and they kept them through kindergarten age, through age 5. I want to tell you a couple of other things about this intervention. One very cool feature is that the control group actually did receive services. Why is that important? It tells us two things. One is the services they received were, improved health access, various kinds of advice, and connecting them with available services and so forth. So was there nutrition as well? Yes, and nutrition, all important. Okay. Why is this important? Because for the Abecedarian intervention kids, they did enjoy better nutrition and better connection to health providers and so forth. And if the control group didn't have those things, you would really never know, well, was it the cognitive and linguistic educational intervention that's making the difference? Or was it just that, they got their vitamin B something or other, they were not iron deficient, whatever. But both groups had those basic and important interventions. The groups differed by whether they got this very special and very effective, we now know, educational intervention. One other reason that this control group design is important is that, like a placebo, these people believe, like a patient taking a placebo, they think, oh, I'm taking a pill. That's great. The people in the control group believed that they were receiving a helpful intervention, as indeed they were. So you can sort of rule out placebo effects as well. Okay. What was the nature of this curriculum? Much could be said on this, and if you want to know in the Q&A, I'm going to direct you to our Abecedarian team here. But they were learning games. They were refreshingly not like drilling on phonics, draw me a picture of something that sounds, that begins with the sound buh, It was, they were games, very open-ended and kid-centered, that emphasized language, using language in conversation with the child, and as the kids got older, emphasized kids doing things together, and inspired by a Russian psychologist from, I guess, early 20th century, whose last name was Vygotsky, who pointed out the important role of language in early childhood in helping kids develop self-control, self-regulation. He pointed out that, young kids, you can hear them, and I remember seeing this with my daughter. Every once in a while, like this internal speech would slip out, and you'd hear it. She'd say, "Now, don't touch the knife." She was kind of like, So basically, the Vygotskian view is that language is important not just for communication, it's also important for self-regulation and cognitive development. And so these were language-intensive methods, and I won't try to say more because I'm not the expert on them. The other great thing about this project is there was long-term follow-up. So they didn't just say, ta-da, I give you a 5-year-old who's better because of all the things that we've done in the last 5 years. They then followed them up through school, through college, or college age, and most recently around the age of 40. Okay, now, in 2016, a personal dream came true for me because I had read about this project for years. And I'm getting goosebumps just like saying this. And I remember thinking, God, it would be so amazing to image those people, but I don't know the Ramies. I don't know. And I ran into Reed Montague at a meeting. I remember this. This really was like a huge thing for me, Reed. We were standing in the lobby of this hotel in Santa Monica, and you said, hey, I'm working with the Ramies, and they have this Abecedarian thing. I was like, what? You're working with the Ramies on the Abecedarian project? And he said, yeah, do you want to, I know you're interested in kids and poverty, do you want to join us? I was like, oh, yes, We have been working together on this project since then. The graduates, if you want to call them that, of the Abecedarian intervention and the control subjects traveled to Roanoke for a day or two of interviewing, testing, and so forth. Already one very interesting paper has come out of it on social decision making, showing a very interesting difference between the adults, now 40 or so, plus or minus, in terms of their response to unfairness and the kind of generosity that they show. This came out in Nature Communications, which, again, if you're not an imaging nerd, I will tell you is a very snazzy journal. But we also got brain images on them. We got brain structure. And so we could ask, does early intervention, this particularly well-known and effective early intervention program, increase brain volume? We scanned them they scanned them here at Virginia Tech. And I will tell you that we took the data from that scanner. And first, we just did a very simple, linear regression we compared intervention versus control, co-varying age and sex, and looked at cortical gray matter volume, white matter volume, leave it at that for now, and found, yes, cortical gray matter volume was significantly increased by the intervention. This is like almost more than 3 decades later, I guess, going on. White matter, we have to talk about the right way to analyze this, but I'm inclined to agree with you about, so I think that we have a significant effect for white matter as well. We also carried out regressions co-varying age, sex, and whole brain volume to analyze the effects of the intervention on small ROIs, which stands for regions of interest. So, it's well known, different gyri play different roles in cognition, emotion, et cetera. We targeted a few specific ROIs which we thought might be the most likely to show a response to the intervention because they are importantly involved in language and in cognitive control, self-control. And I'll show you those ROIs. So here we have, let's see, this is a lateral view of the brain. So this is, somebody's left hemisphere looking that way. We predicted that language, we know that language influences the left inferior frontal gyrus. This is an inflated brain that I'm showing you this on, so it looks a little blimpier and a little longer, but this is essentially Broca's area. And we predicted left superior temporal gyrus. That's kind of classic Wernicke's area. But if you look at a meta-analysis of functional imaging studies of language in the brain, it highlights this whole region here. And for cognitive control, we looked at this area on the right inferior frontal gyrus, because many studies have highlighted that. And also this gyrus on the medial surface of the brain. So this is, if you sectioned my head right here and just looked at the inside surface of this hemisphere, here is the cingulate, the anterior cingulate gyrus on both sides, okay? ACC bilaterally. Okay, what did we find? Well, I'm here to tell you that we found a significant effect on the left inferior frontal gyrus. That was bigger in the kids, not kids anymore, the adults, the midlife adults with the intervention in their past. Did not find anything on the left superior temporal gyrus. We found right inferior temporal gyrus too, a cognitive control area, and we found ACC bilaterally. Let me also mention that, I can't remember if I think I had this on the previous slide, we covaried total brain volume here. What does that mean? It means that these areas weren't bigger just because their brains were overall bigger. Taking into account the overall size of their brain, these areas were disproportionately bigger than you would expect based on their brain size. So this is a fairly selective result. Okay, in sum, this is my last slide. I just want to say, neuroscience is beginning to understand how SES shapes the brain, and from there, the next causal step is behavior, how they function in the world. It's early days. I worry a little bit about some of the more enthusiastic, people. It's not so much the neuroscientists who are over-claiming, but some people who read about the neuroscience research and say, oh, this is great. Now we know, based on neuroscience, that you need to do X, Y, and Z. And I think that's going a little too far right now. Let's not oversell this, partly because I fear that if we sell it too hard and it's the applicability to policy isn't completely there, it'll be dismissed, and then when the field does advance to the stage where it can offer something, nobody's going to listen. So I think we have to be, frank in saying it's early days. We don't know exactly where it's going to go, but I think there is plenty of reason for optimism as we go forward. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Martha. Outstanding presentation. We have time for a few questions or comments.
Yeah,
Sherry, would you
was
stand up so the folks in the back can hear your question?
it the case then that the intervention actually overrode the effect of SES? So that the intervention could offset the difference?
Yeah, that is a great question, which I do not exactly know how to answer. I mean, I think the short answer is we can't conclude that yet. But one thing we can do is, it's a little tough. So these were all very low SES kids, right? I think the selection, you had to be not just below the poverty line, but below 1/2 the poverty line. I mean, really, really disadvantaged kids. Whether their brains grown up look like middle-class kids' brains, I sort of doubt it. That's probably a lot to ask of a 5-year part-time, but yeah. But it's a good question.
Yep, good. Stand up, please, so people can hear your question. Yep.
You alluded to some of the other aspects of SES at the beginning of your talk that could be affecting development outside of income.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if in the development data there was more spread at those kind of transition to middle income. Could that be because other aspects of SES can there compensate for income? Do we know about something like occupational stability, and if that can have a compensatory effect for low income?
Yeah. Well, if I'm understanding your question right, it's a really interesting question that I've never actually seen addressed. I mean, even outside of neuroscience. Are you saying, okay, look, we know that these factors, these income, occupation, neighborhood, we know that they're moderately correlated. They're not super highly correlated. They're maybe like 0.4, 0.5. But is that true? Does the strength of their correlation differ as a function of level, right? So, and I'm guessing it probably does now that you mention it. So, if you're living, in a swanky, Upper East Side apartment in Manhattan, you're really, I don't know, you're just not very likely to have a high school education or unless you're that age, or, very low income, but maybe at lower levels, I just don't know. I would need to think that through. But I think, the question of compensation is a really, is a very interesting one. I don't know what else to say about that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, stand up, please.
At what age does intervention become ineffective?
Well, that, is one of the $64,000 questions. And, you will not be surprised to learn that the people who have worked on that most intensively are economists, because they are really interested in, how do you maximize the return on your investment. The person who's best known for this is Jim Hickman, Jim Heckman at the University of Chicago. And he's done a bunch of different, he invented econometrics. So he definitely knows how to, tease answers out of data. And he's done a bunch of analyses where, in general, it looks like the effects, the ratio of investment to benefit is higher earlier on, and there is no sort of elbow in the curve where suddenly it becomes less. But beyond that, I couldn't tell you. And now there's interesting work by some people, actually developmental neuroscientists, saying that adolescence may be a second critical period, or a second sensitive period. So very young kids, the ages that the Ramies were targeting in Abecedarian, are, Heckman would say, that's the right age based on my econometric analyses. But there's some evidence that targeting adolescents may also be fruitful, more so in adolescence than like age 9 or 10. It's a great question.
If I may, I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
So I can't help but wonder about disentangling the components of what I'm going to call disengagement of a parent under high socioeconomic stress and the pain, if you will, the painful emotions of what it is they're disengaged about, i.e., I'm spending my time worrying about where I'm going to get the money for food and pay the bill. That is not only taking my attention away from my children, but is a painful experience I'm going through. Are there control experiments to look at parents who have disengaged for other reasons, but not suffering the emotional pain of poverty and how that would affect the child's outcome?
I love that idea. What do you think? Can you, yeah.
I think that there are some experiments that are directly relevant, including actually, it's more of a naturalistic study. We know that when parents are unemployed for reasons that are beyond their control, that there is a rapid increase in disengagement from the family and an increase in punitiveness toward their children.
Oh, wow.
So you get a double whammy while you're being overwhelmed and you're trying to cope. And maybe it is that the demands that younger children put on all of us as they are insistent in wanting their needs to be taken care of are perceived as intrusive and for stressed people that may be just beyond their ability to tolerate. And so you get an increase in physical harm to children, and you get an increase in admissions to emergency rooms. If you look at populations, when there has been large-scale unemployment in particular sectors, whether it's in the coal industry or it's in some other industries.
Right,
And
like
so
federal
it's
employees.
really complex cascade.
Fair enough. Thank you both for that. One more question. I see a hand up way in the back. Stand up, please.
Hi, so sorry I was late, but I was paying attention on the live stream.
Oh.
I don't know that in case you went over it, but a lot of my friends from undergrad are like generational curse breakers, like the first to go to college and the first to eventually get a high-paying job, but they're finding out as they're getting into areas where they're finally getting a salary, they're still paying for things back home, they're still under a lot of stress. So is there any work that you have done or that you have seen that even though you have necessarily removed yourself from the high-stress environment and making money and you're having resources, you're still not mentally away from it? How do you think that would affect? Is there anything that works into that?
Nothing is coming to mind. I agree to you. What's that?
Read Montague and what was in the Nature Communication paper. I think it's directly relevant. Is Reed still here?
Right there. Got everybody else answered.
Yeah, no, it's great. I'm learning.
All right, well, are you going to answer, speak to that, Reed?
Read what I was alluding to, and I thought you could explain better than anybody else.
Yeah, I just have 2 sentences that will capture.
Reed, you've never.
This sounds like a stimulus to a conversation over a drink. Please join me in thanking Dr. Farah for an outstanding presentation.